I've got something. I've been chewing around the edges of this for a while, and just kind of really diving into it over the last few days. Trump actually got me thinking about this, and it may be that I'm just naive, and in the in my own white privilege and whatnot, that this seems like a revelation to me, but it's obvious to a bunch of you. So in the spirit of we have the smartest listeners and viewers in America for this program, I'd like to run an idea by you and get your feedback on it. I realize it's anything goes summer. You can call it anything you want, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Let me start out. The big question here, okay? The big question is, why is it that our poor neighborhoods remain poor? Whether it's in inner city Baltimore or whether it's in Appalachia, why is it that our poor neighborhoods remain poor? And I would argue that there is a cycle to this that has three major components. The first is that the schools suck in poor neighborhoods. There's no mystery or surprise to anybody. Schools tend not to do as well in poor neighborhoods. And part of that has been rationalized by people saying, well, that's because poor people are going to those schools and their children start out life with, a smaller vocabulary, and those neighborhoods tend to be more polluted and, lead poisoning, God only knows. But anyhow, there's that argument. And I'm going to tell you why I think that those are all secondary arguments. The second is that policing tends to be different in poor communities and communities of color. And frankly, worse. It's not as high quality as the policing in wealthy white neighborhoods, or even in suburban upper middle class neighborhoods. And the third is that we're really starting to learn this clearly now, is that people of color literally have to stand in line twice as long as white people to vote every 2 years. Why is that? So here's the Trump riff that got me started thinking about this. Here he is. Here's Donald Trump.
I say it again. What do you have to lose? Look, what do you have to lose? You're living in poverty. Your schools are no good. You have no jobs. 58% of your youth is unemployed. What the hell do you have to lose?
So, first of all, Trump, to a large extent, is just perpetuating white stereotypes of black communities, And in fact, it's quite insulting. And the what do you have to lose is really easily answered by simply going through all the things that the Republicans are trying to undo. They've successfully, in fact, gutted the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. They want to go after, frankly, everything all the way back to Brown v. Board. So there's a lot to lose. But setting that aside, because that argument has been well made both on this program and in other places, what I think is going on here is that this is a piece of the new Jim Crow, to paraphrase Michelle Alexander, that has to do, and I think the conservatives have been doing this really slick for a long time. And I think it all has to do with it's the money, stupid. People stand in line in poor communities twice as long to vote as they do in rich communities. Why? Because voting systems are paid for at the county level. So there's a smaller budget to run good voting operations. You have fewer voting machines, or you have fewer ballot places, or you have fewer locations, you have fewer poll workers, so the lines get longer. So, because they depend on the local property tax and the local income tax in those communities that have it. So that's voting. Schools are paid. I went off on a rant about this yesterday. Schools are paid by property taxes. Therefore, poor neighborhoods have bad schools. Good neighborhoods have great schools. It's real simple. It's got nothing to do with charter schools or school choice or any of that kind of BS. This is just flack that's being thrown into the wind by, in some cases, well-meaning liberals. More often, I'd say, conservatives who want to have private for-profit charter schools replace public education. But anyhow, the schools are funded locally. And then third, our police departments. Why do police departments, why do they have bad hiring standards? Why do they hire in communities of color in particular, why do you tend to get police officers who are the bottom of the barrel, basically? They're not necessarily the best paid. They're certainly not the best trained. Why? Well, because they're funded locally. So where did this come from? These three things are the quality of the future of the neighborhood, which is the schools, the quality of life of the present of the neighborhood, which is the police, and the ability of the neighborhood to have a say in its own governance, which is voting. How is it that all three of these things suck in poor communities? And by the way, in poor white communities as well as black communities, although it seems to be worse in some African-American communities. Why is it that they suck? Even in the face of efforts to change things, I would say it's because they're all funded locally. And conservatives have been promoting this idea of local control. And I would suggest to you that local control is a euphemism for local funding. The last thing people in white wealthy suburbs want to do is have their property tax dollars or their income tax dollars go to pay for schools in poor black neighborhoods. They don't want to pay for the police in the poor black neighborhoods, and they don't want to pay for the voting stations in poor black neighborhoods or just poor neighborhoods. And so these neighborhoods then find themselves locked into this cycle of poverty because they don't have the resources to pull themselves out. So how do we break that? I think it's very straightforward. We say voting, schools, and police are critical infrastructure. These three things are absolutely necessary for the functioning of any community. And there's a minimum threshold that they have to reach in terms of the quality of the services they're providing. And that minimum threshold is not being reached in poor communities and communities of color. So how do you fix that? You define them as critical infrastructure, and then you pass legislation. You change the rules of the game, basically, because the rules of the game have been set up, I would argue, since the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that the rules of the game have been set up so that basically poverty perpetuates itself. And that if every school in a state got the same funding, if every police department in the state got the same funding, if every voting and polling place in the state got the same funding, you'd still have a problem of poor states like Louisiana not having as high quality those three things as wealthy states like Massachusetts. But at least in Louisiana, everybody in the really genuinely poor areas would be lifted up in these three areas. And I would suggest that within a generation or so, you would see, as a consequence of that, you would see people coming out of poverty. Schools would improve, policing would improve, and people would become more civically engaged because, particularly in poor communities, voting is a real sacrifice. You've got to take time off from work, typically from jobs that don't have paid time off. In wealthy white suburban neighborhoods, I'm going to take the afternoon off, no big deal, right? But if you're a wage earner, an hourly paid employee, having to stand in line for 6 hours is a much bigger deal than having to stand in line for 1 hour. So let's equalize the payment for this stuff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And let's call out the conservatives who have been using the 10th Amendment and this whole idea of local control as a way of keeping poor communities down for exactly what they're doing.